Part 8 of Work of the Sisters during the Epidemic of Influenza, October 1918, by Francis Edward TOURSCHER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 8. Incarnation, Olney, Philadelphia. Very valuable service was rendered to the sisters here by a good gentleman, a non-Catholic, who came every morning to take the sisters to the different homes where their attention was requested. Another gentleman, also a non-Catholic, came faithfully each evening at 6:15 p.m. to take the sisters who were serving there to the emergency hospital at Holmesburg, where they were due at 7 p.m., and every morning when they came off duty at 7 a.m. he was waiting to take them back to their convent. He was never 1 minute late, either morning or evening, though these trips must have entailed great personal sacrifice, since his business hours usually were from 9 to 4. The first necessity in nearly every home in this district seemed to be fresh air and God's own sunlight, though in many cases this was not obtained by the sisters without much coaxing and even some altercation. In one home, where mother and father were desperately ill, two little ones were found trying to build a fire to get something to eat and warm themselves. Here, after 3 days, a nurse was obtained. On answering another urgent request to attend one of their little schoolgirls, we found, to our dismay, not a little girl, but an old lady of the same name, who stood mumbling something utterly unintelligible to us. Finally, we made out, "Yes, them are there, pretty much sick." Instead of the little girl whom we were seeking, we discovered the little girl's sister-in-law, a non-Catholic, and her brother, a fallen-away Catholic. Here, too, was much to be done, and after sending a messenger for another sister to find the little girl, we remained to nurse these victims. After following the doctor's directions for several days, we had both on the safe way to recovery. When two of our sisters went to a house in Olney, where assistance had been required, the colored servant who opened the door left them in dismay and fled to the mistress of the house. While waiting patiently on the doorstep for admission, the sisters overheard the following dialogue. "Missy, who am them ladies downstairs?" "Why, they are the sisters from the convent, Delia." To which the reply came in utmost scorn. "Sisters! Dem ain't no sisters down there. Dem is sure 'nuff German spies, and dis nigger leaves dis house de minute dey comes in." After many explanations from the good lady, a non-Catholic, who was too ill to leave her bed, Delia was finally persuaded to grant admission to the suspected spies. After a short hour, she admitted grudgingly, "Well, I judge dey is 'Nited States citizens, all right." From another colored servant in the same district came the surprised remark, "Who'd ever think dem dar sisters could wash and clean and do sech cooking?" In one home, the only one free from the dread disease was an infant of 9 months, whom the sisters found, seated on the floor, regaling himself with oranges and candy galore. Surely an unusual diet for a baby. Mother, father, and 4 little ones in this home were victims of influenza. One little boy, running a temperature of 103 degrees, cried loudly, "Bad lady, bad lady," whenever the sisters attempted to approach him. After a good alcohol bath and some nourishing broth, however, his melody changed to "Dood lady, dood lady." This he continued incessantly in a sort of semi-delirium until he fell into a soothing sleep. All these patients, non-Catholics, recovered, and evinced sincere gratitude to the sisters. The horror in which some of the sufferers held fresh air and sunlight may be imagined by the fact that in one home the sisters had to tell the patients, who fortunately in this instance were Catholics, that the Archbishop had issued orders that windows be opened wide. One poor woman here had on 4 coats and 3 sweaters. She was well covered in bed, besides. The sisters discovered, moreover, that she was physically well, but suffered from a very vivid imagination. She was sure of this, however, and it was proving quite as serious as the reality. After getting her to take a walk in the fresh air, the sisters cleaned and arranged the house, which had been sadly neglected, and prepared a meal for the poor husband, who had had nothing substantial for several days. This case was later turned over to a district nurse. In many cases, the sisters found that patients were suffering more from starvation and neglect than from influenza. Most Blessed Sacrament, Philadelphia. One family to which we were called early during the epidemic was in great distress. The mother of 4 little boys, a victim of the dread disease, was suffering intensely from an abscess in the ear. Her husband had remained at home until his pecuniary circumstances became such that return to work was imperative. As he was a non-Catholic, he came as a last desperate resource to the Sisters for help. During the first few days we found plenty to do on account of the neglected condition of the house, but nothing seemed to relieve the suffering of the poor mother. One day we begged her to pin a Sacred Heart badge on her pillow. She consented. That night the abscess broke. Relief was then instantaneous. From that time her entire physical condition improved, and each day when we arranged her hair and dressed the sore ear, she begged us to replace the badge. Both she and the little ones became quite attached to the Sisters. In the same neighborhood we discovered an anxious mother, heartbroken, keeping watch beside her only son, who had become delirious shortly after having received the last sacraments. He had been an exemplary youth, and now he was pleading earnestly with his mother to allow him to become a nun, and begging her to tell him how long it would take. We seemed to calm him, so we remained until late that night, whispering ejaculations whenever we discerned some ray of consciousness. When we returned the next day, we found that he had died a very peaceful death. We were called out late one evening to the home of a Polish family in the parish, where a mother, father, and 5 little children were tossing with fever, and crying for food. All were seriously ill, and the neighbors were afraid to enter or offer any assistance. They could speak only a little English, and when we entered, the mother sobbed loudly, "Oh, Sisters dear, I knew God would not forget us. Look, my dear little baby." Going over to the child, I saw it was dead. The condition of the father was most serious, so after pinning Sacred Heart badges on all, we sent a messenger for the priest to administer the last sacraments. He made 3 visits to that poor home during the night, fearing that the man would die before the morning. Placing all our trust in the Sacred Heart, we watched and ministered to these poor sufferers continually during that long night, and our confidence was rewarded. When the non-Catholic doctor arrived next day, he was pleased with the improvement of all, but the man said to him, "You no cure me, my church make me better." We spent 2 weeks with this poor neglected family, and then, when all were able to be out of bed, we found a new field for mercy among the sufferers in the mining districts around Pottsville. One day a poor man came to the convent in his auto, begging for assistance. Though he had wealth at his command, he was unable to get a nurse for his dying wife and child, an infant of a few months. Here the Sisters remained during the first night. Afterwards one stayed all day, and another sister came during the night. After about a week's care, both patients were pronounced out of danger, and these Sisters were called to relief work in Pottsville. St. Paul's, Philadelphia. Most of the Sisters of this mission, 34 in all, were assigned to duty in the hospitals at Holmesburg and at Phoenixville. About 10, however, devoted their services to the poor Italians in the immediate vicinity of St. Paul's. Many of these sufferers were unable to speak English. One sister says, "Our first experience was with a family of Italians. On entering the house, we found a bed all pulled apart, the bed linen scattered over the floor, and everything in the room awry. After asking many questions, we gleaned from the broken English of their replies that the mother had been buried just that morning. 8 children, ranking in age from 18 months to 13 years, remained. They were in the adjoining room, which contained little else than 4 beds, 2 children in each, all seemingly stricken with influenza. Shortly after, the father returned from the mother's funeral in desperation. He told us that for no amount of money could he secure a nurse for the little ones. Not understanding English very well, he was incredulous when we finally made him understand that we would care for his children. First, these good sisters made up the bed in the room from which the mother had been taken. Then they scrubbed the floor, a sanitary measure very much needed. Then the children were washed, given clean clothing, and transferred to the larger bed, while the other room was thoroughly cleaned. The two younger children, meanwhile, shared the cradle. When they were given nourishment, the little lad of 2 years smiled brightly, and after many questions it was discovered that he had no other ailment than cutting teeth. Of course he was immediately removed from the others. The little lad had been hungry only, and the nourishment revived him. After about a week's care and nursing, all these little ones had recovered, and the father was so impressed that he returned to the sacraments, which he had neglected for years. He said he had absolutely forgotten God and his church, but when he saw the sisters enter his home to do gratuitously what others would not do for money, he began to wonder why they did so, and his meditation on this led him back to God. In another home in the Italian district, a father was caring for a sick wife. In bed with her was an infant. A child about a year older lay in a crib nearby, and in the adjoining room 3 other little ones occupied one bed, all 6 victims of influenza. Here, too, the sisters found ample scope for their charity, also evidence of sincere gratitude. The poor foreigners, who could hardly speak a word of English, expressed their sense of sincere thankfulness in the livelier language of Italian gesticulation. At the request of a businessman of the same district, the sisters visited a house where another father was tending to 5 motherless children. Here the greatest poverty was evident, but through the generosity of their kind benefactor, the sisters were able to procure a physician, also to purchase some food, fuel, and clothing, as were necessary. These little ones were entrusted entirely to the care of the sisters while their father was away at work, and later, when they were convalescing, it was amusing to find them sending over to the convent, without their father's knowledge, to tell the sisters that they were hungry, and please send over something to eat. The baby boy had an extremely high fever for some days, and when it began to abate, the incredulous father knelt all of one day by the bedside, fearing that death was imminent. All in this house recovered. In another tenement we found a mother and 3 sick children. The mother, though not ill herself, was absolutely helpless in the question of caring for the suffering little ones. We squeezed an orange which we found lying on one of the beds, and gave the juice to the 2 little girls. When the mother saw how the children brightened by this little refreshment, she asked through an interpreter, whom we had brought with us, what she should do for the baby who was just gasping for breath. We feared that even a teaspoonful of liquid would choke the little one, so we instructed the poor woman how to accustom the child's throat gradually to it by first moistening its lips. The look of gratitude we received in return from that poor woman, who could not speak one word of English, more than repaid us for any little inconvenience we experienced during that day. After several visits to this poor home, the mother began to understand how to care for the little victims, and soon all were on the way to recovery. In one place a delirious patient was found gazing intently from the window. Sister asked, in order to rouse him, "Are you looking for someone or something?" "Oh, no," came the reply. "I'm just watching the sunset." It was then between 8 and 9 p.m. Another poor laborer thought he was in a shop, and insisted that Sister turn the horses' heads the other way. Evidently he mistook her for his assistant, for when, disregarding his injunction, she continued arranging his room, he called out, "That spoils you, George." Sacred Heart, Philadelphia. In this district the sisters have been subjected to all sorts of indignities for many years. They could scarcely leave the convent without encountering Jews who openly insulted them. Even the very children spat at them, threw mud at them, or, what was much more deplorable, called aloud such epithets as "Jesus girls." From one of the sisters we learn that the work of the sisters in the homes of these poor, unbelieving Jews during the epidemic has been productive of a marked change of sentiment and outward demeanor. The sisters unselfishly visited these poor people and voluntarily nursed those who required assistance. At first the Jews were incredulous. Later they received the sisters in wondering gratitude. As a result, those people who formerly despised openly the habit of the religious now as openly manifest toward it marks of reverence and respect. A pathetic incident, the result of a mixed marriage, comes from the same district. A father and two children, Catholics, a mother and her sister, non-Catholics, and very strongly prejudiced against everything Catholic, were all victims of the influenza, with no one to care for them. The sisters took charge of this home. Every evening the sisters, at the request of the father, would recite the rosary and litany of our Blessed Mother for the sick and dying. One evening, after the prayers had been said, the little girl called, "Daddy, won't you say an extra prayer for your own little girl? She is so sick." The mother looked up sadly and asked, "Catherine, dear, why don't you ask Mother to pray for you too?" To which the little one replied, "But, Mother, you don't pray like Daddy and Brother and me." The mother surely had food for thought, and later on she asked the sisters for Catholic books to read. Since her recovery she goes to Mass every Sunday, and the husband is hopeful that soon she will enter the true fold. Her sister, too, though not convinced, has been very much softened by her association with the sisters, and now is careful to show them every outward courtesy and respect. St. Thomas Aquinas, Philadelphia. Very few of the private homes in this district required the attention of the sisters, as most of the victims of influenza were removed to the emergency hospitals on South Broad Street. Several calls, however, were answered. In one poor home the sisters found a mother and 6 small children, Italians, afflicted with the dread disease. The father, who had been attending them for 9 days alone, seemed helpless in his grief, for the doctor had just told him that one of the children, a dear little girl, had only an hour to live. Here the sisters bathed the mother and children, cleaned their rooms, prepared nourishing broths, and administered the medicines as the doctor had directed. All during the night they kept watch in this poor home. The next day, finding the patients somewhat improved, the sisters returned to their convent for a brief rest. For several days, during which the patients, all except the little girl, gradually improved, the sisters occupied their leisure moments in cleaning the house and doing a very large wash that had been accumulating for several weeks. Transfiguration, Philadelphia. One of the sisters writes, "On Monday, October 14th, at the request of Father Fitzmaurice of Frankfurt, we visited a Jew on Pine Street. His wife was most respectful, and told us in all confidence that she had sent for the sisters because she was sure such good ladies would make her husband better. The poor man was beyond the reach of earthly assistance, however, and he died soon after our arrival. During the early days of the epidemic, a man called at the convent to ask for one of the sisters to go to a young girl who was dying. The gentleman was not of our faith, but he had been sent by the priest to tell us that the girl was alone among non-Catholics. The poor child did not realize that death was near, so after preparing her for the sacraments, we sent for the priest and got all in readiness for the visit of the divine guest. She did not linger long after receiving the sacraments. We continued praying with her until the end, and the non-Catholics with whom she lived did all in their power to make us feel comfortable and to render the last moments of their young friend peaceful. Her death seemed to have made a very deep impression on all who were present at the scene, to them so unusual." St. Veronica's, Philadelphia. Late one Sunday evening, 2 of the sisters were hurried to a house on 2nd Street, where a sick mother, a dying father, and 4 very sick children were in sad need of care. The mother, though in a serious condition, was making an effort to attend to the others. They had called on the Red Cross for assistance in vain. The most urgent need was to prepare both husband and wife for the last sacraments, and to send a messenger for the priest, who came immediately. All night we waited on them and tried to make them as comfortable as possible in the midst of their utter destitution. When morning dawned, realizing their serious condition, we at once determined to have them admitted to one of the hospitals, as their poor home was in such a condition as to make it absolutely impossible for us to give them proper care, and the neighborhood was one of the worst in the city. Every emergency to which we applied was crowded, so we continued our work with them unremittingly until Wednesday night at 10 o'clock. 72 hours at least, when a patrol came and removed the father and children to the emergency on Arch Street. Later it returned to take the mother to the municipal hospital, where after a few days' suffering she died a peaceful, happy death. Father and babies later recovered. Another sister from St. Veronica's tells of an encounter with a young man of the parish, then in one of the emergency hospitals. He had not been to the sacraments for 7 years, and begged as a great favor that sister bring him a priest, promising to grant her any favor she would ask in return. The priest soon reconciled this strayed sheep, and also his wife, who was in the women's ward downstairs. This man has not forgotten his promise to the sister, who begged as her reward that he attend Mass and the sacraments regularly. The sister has seen this man attending Holy Mass regularly ever since, often even on days not of obligation. St. Catherine's Wane. The first call of the sisters at St. Catherine's was to relieve conditions in the Italian colony. These poor people were terrified by the symptoms which they noted in their sick, and the district nurse, a non-Catholic, in her appeal to the sisters, told them in despair that there was no response to treatment, no control of the spreading malady, due partly to the fright of the foreigners, partly to their misunderstanding of the orders and directions of doctors and nurses. The sisters began their work in this foreign district October 10. They first made a tour of inspection to find out who was sick and what was needed. Their report of conditions says, worse than we anticipated. In one home, the sisters found 8 victims in bed, and a little girl, 8 years old, the only nurse, housekeeper, and cook. Luckily, she had had little to do in the line of cooking, as the patients were, as they thought, carrying out the doctor's orders, and had taken absolutely no nourishment for several days. They were starving, and as symptoms were not serious, the sisters countermanded the doctor's orders, real or imaginary, ordered nourishment, prepared it themselves in a strangely un-American kitchen, and soon had the victims free of one peril at least. The sisters gave strict orders for cleanliness and the taking of medicines as the doctors prescribed. There was a general clean-up, sweeping, dusting, scrubbing, and a fair promise of normal sanitary conditions. Bed linens were brought out and put to use, which apparently had been serving as heirlooms in the family or ornaments for state occasions. In one home, 3 different doctors had left prescriptions. Following the sisters' orders literally, the 3 drugs were given to the victims, 1 dose of each every 3rd hour, with apparently no harmful results. In many homes, the people, even the children, were in bed, wearing their working clothes and street apparel. They had not the proper garments, the sister reports, and generally no bed linens. One man was in bed wearing an overcoat and a fur cap drawn over his ears, with all available bedclothes piled on. He was armored against the germ, but had not succeeded in shutting out the disease. In some cases there was no food in the house. The sisters sent out for it, then prepared it and fed the people until they were able to do for themselves. We were welcomed, reports the sister, in every house, with only one exception. In this one home, we inquired at the door if they had any sick. The father informed us that they had 5 in bed upstairs, but they did not need our help, as their patrons, the man was a pervert from the faith, had sent a nurse, and they were properly cared for. Sadly, the sisters adds, 2 of these children died at the end of the week. Out of the 38 cases attended by the sisters, there were only 2 deaths. Every morning, as the sisters appeared on the avenue, they were met by troops of kiddies eager for the honor of a visit from the sisters, and each clan ready to guide them to its own particular tenement. After 10 days of this nursing, cleaning, and cooking, the colony was getting back to normal life and native diet, and the Sisters were free to give more time and help to the emergency hospitals at Bryn Mawr, Paoli, and Wayne, where 6 Sisters served until October 31. In Bryn Mawr, they worked in conjunction with the Sisters of Mercy from Bryn Mawr and Rosemont, taking charge of the afternoon day shift. In Paoli, they had the day shift. In Wayne, the night shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. End of Part 8.